What's up guys, my name is Ace, and a few days ago I made a video talking about my best ranked play setups, and many people were noticing I was putting the high velocity rounds on my TAC-56 class setups. And this had a lot of people confused because within the 6v6 maps in this game, you're typically not getting really long range gunfights. And the base bullet velocity on assault rifles is pretty good. Plus, for ranked play, I'm always using that 17.5-inch barrel on the TAC-56, which bumps my bullet velocity up to 664 meters per second. And on paper, if we do the math for that, this should be more than enough bullet velocity to feel great within nearly every gunfight you'll ever find on a 6v6 map. So why would you also add high velocity rounds on top of that? This is a huge question I've been getting since I uploaded that video. And since then, I've actually gone in and done some testing, and I found some pretty surprising results that I wanted to share with you guys. But before we get into those results of the actual in-game testing, if we're just talking about this in theory or on paper, obviously the higher your bullet velocity gets, the sooner your bullet is going to hit the target, and therefore the better your hit detection is going to feel. And technically, if you're in a really close gunfight, your bullet arriving a little bit sooner may make the difference between winning or losing that gunfight. We're talking extremely small margins that would only come into play in very rare instances, but still, your bullet will be getting there faster. Additionally, when it comes to high velocity rounds, they do hurt our damage range, but only very slightly. It turns out this is only a 3% reduction to your damage range, which is going to be changing our maximum damage range, for instance, by less than a meter with the TAC-56. And therefore, it's a fairly negligible downside for an upside that, at least in theory, should be helping you out in any mid to longer range gunfight. At least to some degree. Even if it just makes your hit detection feel very slightly better, it's worth this tiny range reduction. And that's the explanation I've been giving people because, in theory, like I said, that just all makes sense to me. However, I went in and did some testing at 120 FPS at multiple range increments with different configurations of the TAC-56. That's what I'm going to focus on here since this is primarily designed for those ranked or competitive players out there. And let's have a look at my findings. I tested 3 different setups here. The base TAC-56 with no attachments at impact velocity at all, so we have a 590 meter per second bullet velocity. Then I had a setup with just that Tundra barrel, which improves our bullet velocity up to 664 meters per second, but there was no high velocity rounds put on this on top of that. And then finally, we have a combination of that Tundra barrel and high velocity rounds for a total bullet velocity of 957 meters per second. For each of these tests, I fired 10 rounds and then took the average of how long it took for a hit marker to appear on the screen after firing the shot. At 20 meters with the first setup, it took 50 milliseconds on average for that bullet to hit. With just the Tundra barrel, it took an average of 45 milliseconds for the bullet to hit. And with the combination of the Tundra and high velocity rounds, it also took 45 milliseconds on average for that bullet to hit. So at 20 meters, there is a very slight improvement by increasing your bullet velocity, although there's no extra improvement for combining the barrel with high velocity rounds. And honestly, a 5 millisecond difference isn't going to be noticeable at all. But then let's have a look at 40 meters, and once again, with no velocity attachments on here, it took an average of 50 milliseconds for that bullet to hit, so surprisingly no change from the 20 meter range. With the Tundra, it's now taking 49 milliseconds on average for that to hit, and then with the combination, it's an average of 50 milliseconds. So effectively speaking, they're all the same here at 40 meters. There's no apparent benefit to using higher velocity rounds at this range with this gun. Now, when we move back even further to our 60 meter range, this is where the differences really start to come out. And it's worth noting, at least with most of the maps in this game, it's pretty rare to get a gunfight 60 meters or beyond, at least in a practical line of sight that you would actually be using on a regular basis. In either case, let's get into the results here. With the base gun without velocity rounds, on average, it was taking about 100 milliseconds for that bullet to register. So now we've doubled the amount of time to get there, even though we didn't double the distance. Then with the Tundra, we actually got a slightly better result than at 40 meters, which was surprising. It took on average 44 milliseconds for the bullet to hit. And with the combination with the best bullet velocity possible here, it took an average of 57 milliseconds for that bullet to hit. And that definitely seems to be backwards. You would think the higher the velocity, the lower the number, but at least in this particular situation, that's not the case. And again, this wasn't just a one-off test or anything. This is looking at averages. And on average, just using the Tundra barrel meant that my bullets were arriving slightly sooner than combining the Tundra barrel with high velocity rounds. It's not a massive difference, but it's enough of a difference that it is worth mentioning here. Now finally, I did want to take it one step further just to see a really extreme example at 80 meters. At this point, you would be extremely hard-pressed. Even if you were actively trying, you'd be super hard-pressed to find a practical line of sight that's 80 meters long in this game. But I did want to test this anyway, just to see what that extreme looks like. And for the base setup, it once again took around 100 milliseconds for that shot to register. Then with just the Tundra barrel equipped, it's now taking you on average about 100 milliseconds as well. So same as the base gun. And it seems like you lose that bullet velocity benefit once you start to get to this extreme. And then finally, with that combination of attachments, this is where we see the real benefit of this. And our bullets were arriving on average 52 milliseconds later. And at least this time, that's actually something you would expect to see. The combination with the maximum bullet velocity is giving you a very noticeable benefit in this more extreme scenario at 80 meters. So overall, when I look at all the data that I collected here and the average engagement distance that you would find, for my TAC-56 rank play setup at least, but you could apply this to other guns as well, I would like to at least put something on the gun that improves bullet velocity, whether that be the Tundra barrel or the high velocity rounds. Because in that 60 meter range, which I may see from time to time, there is a very noticeable improvement there compared to just using the base gun. In fact, the bullet will arrive effectively twice as fast in this case. Having said this though, after collecting all this data, at least within the 6v6 maps, I'm really seeing now that there's not much benefit at all to using high velocity rounds combined with that Tundra barrel on the TAC-56. Maybe if you're playing Invasion or Ground War, where you may actually run into several gunfights beyond 80 meters, but within 6v6, and especially within the competitive maps that you're playing, you're quite simply not getting into gunfights beyond 80 meters. That's not going to be happening at all. And as a result, it does turn out to be a little bit of a waste of an attachment here. Now, another thing to acknowledge is with ranked play and the competitive rule set, you are pretty limited on which attachments you can use. So if you feel like there's no better attachment to use on your setup, and you want to just make sure you're safe just in case you get into an extremely long-range gunfight, fine, by all means, throw those high-velocity rounds on there. However, if we're looking for true optimization, it appears you're better off dropping that high-velocity ammo and potentially using something else on the setup if you can think of anything more worthwhile to use. So in the case of my ranked accuracy build with the TAC-56, I'm actually going to be making a change here. I'm going to be dropping those high velocity rounds from there since I'm not really noticing much of a benefit, and instead, I'm just going to throw on the FSS Sharkfin 90 underbarrel stock. This now means that my gun is going to be more stable overall, not only when I'm just aiming down sight and not firing my gun, but also as I'm firing my gun, you will be getting slightly better recoil since that sway is cut down. And honestly, I'm never going to notice a difference without those high velocity rounds on there because I'm not taking gunfights beyond 80 meters. And with that, that's pretty much everything I've got for you guys with today's video. If you are using those high velocity rounds, especially within this specific context of like ranked play and the TAC-56, you may want to consider dropping those and going with something else on your class. And with that, that's going to wrap it up for today's video on the high velocity rounds. Overall, at least for 6v6, I'll definitely be reconsidering high velocity rounds on some of my setups. But if I were to play Ground War or Invasion or maybe even DMZ or Warzone, I'd still recommend going for the maximum possible bullet velocity because in those more extreme ranges, it clearly appears to help by quite a large margin. And this is where I'm curious to hear from you guys in those comments down below. First up, were you guys surprised by the results that I found in today's video? And second, will you be making any adjustments to your class setups now that you've seen this video? Or are you just going to stick with that combination of high velocity rounds and a barrel to also improve velocity? If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.